All right, welcome back everybody. If this is your first time to the channel, welcome to Notes to Fret, where we are all about turning theory into riffs. And in this video, we're going to continue our conversation about these scales and the modes. And here we're going to very specifically be finishing off our conversation about the Mixolydian mode. This is part 3 of our discussion on Mixolydian, so if you haven't seen the other two, you definitely want to go back and just check them out because we're really going to move pretty quickly through some of the parts that we've already discussed in those previous videos. So again, you should definitely have some background on scales and circle of fifths for this video. Again, PSA, because I know these videos can be a little bit long, so want to make sure that everybody's getting good use out of their time. But with that being said, let's start the review really quick. At the top we have Ionian, or the major scale, and at the bottom we have Mixolydian, right? So when we're looking at the Ionian and the Mixolydian, as we're looking at the comparison, we can see that the sixth interval is different between the two, right? And since they're both major, we can compare the major modes directly to one another, right? So we see that the sixth interval is a whole step in Ionian and a half step in Mixolydian. And what does that ultimately give us? Well, it ultimately is going to give us a lowered seventh in Mixolydian, or a flattened seventh. You're going to hear them both equally. So if we look at the C major scale, we look at the seventh and we see that B. Okay, but we know that the Mixolydian is the fifth degree of the major mode, right? So that means we're going to start with that G. So therefore, G Mixolydian is what comes out of C Ionian, right? And in order to get the different intervals, we just start with that whole step immediately following the G. That's it. So here we're looking at the Ionian scale at the top, the Mixolydian down at the bottom. But if we look over at that seventh, it's hard to say, oh, that F somehow is a flattened seventh. It's just weird to look at. But the first thing we need to do is verify that Mixolydian is indeed a major mode. So we look at the third, and we see that the third is 2 whole steps or 4 frets from the tonic. Therefore, we know that Mixolydian is major. Now, looking at the seventh here, again, it's just hard to see that the seventh is flattened. But since we have 2 major modes, we can directly compare C Ionian at the top to C Mixolydian down at the bottom. And now, when we look at that whole step and half step between the sixth and the seventh, now we can understand that, hey, that half step from A to B means we have to have a B flat, right? Now, the other thing that happens with that B flat has, it has downstream effects. And so here, as opposed to numbering them just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we're going to use the Roman numerals, right? Uppercase is major, lowercase is minor, right? And if it has the diminished symbol there as well. And we can see at the top, we have, just your C major scale. Now, when we apply the same to the Mixolydian down at the bottom, we can very quickly see that the third, the fifth, and the seventh are distinguished or distinctly different between the 2 modes, right? So we've got E minor in the major scale up at the top, and we have E diminished down at the bottom. Same thing at the top, we have G major. Down at the bottom, we have G minor. That is a lowercase v. Might be a little tricky to look at on the video, but it is a lowercase Roman numeral 5. Then we have that half step and whole step. And so immediately we're looking at the difference between the seventh, whereas it's B diminished in the major scale at the top, and it's B flat major in the Mixolydian mode at the bottom, okay? So that pretty much covers the review. If any of this isn't making sense to you, please go back, look at the first 2 videos on Mixolydian, because this is really what we cover in those first 2 videos. So with that being said, what I want to do to kind of understand the next layer of looking at modes is modes are a flavoring. You don't really change keys when you change modes, right? So it's something to always be very careful of, and that's what I want to look at here. But in order to do that, the first thing I want to do is look at C major. And here we have C major, C Ionian, however you want to look at it. And in the circle of fifths, we have the C major key kind of highlighted, if you will. Now, as we look at C major, we recognize some of the general principles of the major mode, right? We look at C major and we know that the first is a major, in this case it's C major. The second is a minor, in this case it's D minor. The third is a minor, in this case E minor. The fourth is a major, in this case F major, so on and so forth, right? So we have the fifth is G major, the sixth is A minor, and the seventh is diminished. In this case, again, it's B diminished. Now, then we just either circle back to the tonic or circle back to the octave, however you want to look at that last C. But we see that the first, the fourth, the fifth are major, the second, the third, and the sixth are minor, and the seventh is diminished, right? That's every Ionian key out there, right? So, with that being said, if we move just a little bit counterclockwise and we move over into F, that's the next thing that we're going to evaluate. And there'll be a reason why, I'll explain why. But right off the bat, you can see that C major and F major are going to be neighboring keys, right? And we'll break this down a little bit more, but they're neighboring keys, right? So just keep that in mind that they're very close to one another. Now here, the similarities between F major and C major, they both have F major, they both have C major, they both have D minor, and they both have A minor, okay? No change there. However, we'll notice that the G major, the E minor, and certainly the B diminished, well, that's not gonna hold when we move into F major. Those are very specific towards the C major key or C major scale, both, right? Now, when we look at that E minor, which is our third, and we look at that G major, which is our fifth, and then obviously the B diminished, which is our seventh, we spoke in the previous slide about paying attention to the third, the fifth, and the seventh, right? Well, as we move away from C major, we kind of leave that G major, E minor, and B diminished. We kind of leave that behind. And when we move into F major, we now have the actual F major key. And here we have a B flat major, a G minor, and an E diminished, right? So that's different from what we looked at with C major. Now here, again, we've just gone to our neighboring key in the counterclockwise direction, but we have F major recognized here. And so we'll realign the scale over to the right, and now we're looking at F major. Okay, now the only real kind of accidental in here is the fourth, which is B flat, right? Everything else, no sharps, no flats, except the fifth, we have a B flat, okay? And again, you can see that we have E diminished and all this good stuff, right? So, with all of that, when we look at the B flat major, the G minor, and the E diminished, we know that that's a difference. And so let's look at the Mixolydian so we can kind of start to piece in together why I'm talking about F major and C major, or in this case, C Mixolydian. Why am I using this specific example? Well, if we look down at the bottom, we can see that we definitely have a B flat in the C Mixolydian. It's the only accidental, right? So just comparing note for note in the scale, well, all of a sudden, it looks like we have the scale is identical, right? The exact same notes. Now here, we'll notice where the diminished is. And in this case, it's E diminished in Mixolydian, which is down at the bottom, which is the third, right? Our third is E diminished in C Mixolydian. Well, we know that we have a E diminished in the F major scale as well. And we have a G minor. Well, we have a G minor in the F major as well. And furthermore, we have a B flat major in the F major key. Now, looking at that, we can immediately see that even though we have an E diminished in the third for the Mixolydian, we also have E diminished in F Ionian, it happens to be in the 7th. So the B flat major, it's major in both the C Mixolydian down at the bottom, as well as the F Ionian or the F major up at the top, right? So here, when we look at the 3rd, the 5th, and the 7th, well, those are distinguishing factors of the Mixolydian, of C Mixolydian, and incidentally, they are also the same factors in F major. So all of a sudden, if we look at these two, they're virtually identical. So how do we play music that leverages the Mixolydian mode rather than the Ionian mode, right? So when we're looking at F major and C major, we want to consider the tonic, and that's our home sound, if you will. Even though in our previous video we spoke about Mixolydian doesn't have that huge, enormous drive back to the tonic, it's still your bass sound. You can't ignore it completely when you go into Mixolydian. It just has less of a pull. There's a lot of modes that just really have a lot of dissonance when you get away from the tonic, and there's a big pull back to that tonic, right? And it's very powerful when you come back to it. Mixolydian doesn't really have that hyper pull away where your listener's desperate to come back to that tonic, but you still come back to it periodically. Again, you don't ignore it completely. So when we're looking at the difference between F major at the top and C Mixolydian down at the bottom, one of the things that we need to pay attention to is, what do we come back to? Now, one of the things, and we haven't spoken about chord progressions yet, and we'll get into that in the next series of videos, but the chord progressions really are a methodology of taking your listener away from the tonic and then bringing them back to the tonic, right? It's just kind of a push and pull methodology for writing songs. And with that, it's, that's where the power of your music is going to come in. How do you really do that? But what I want to do is just use an example here of one of the distinguishing differences. So we've spoken about the diminished chords kind of being off limits to us, right? And so in F Ionian or F major, the 7th is kind of off limits to us because it's E diminished. But in C Mixolydian down at the bottom, the 3rd is kind of off limits to us because that's where the E diminished resides, right? And so what that does to us in our chord progression as an example is if we want to go from the 7th back to our tonic, if you're looking up at the F major at the top and you're moving from E to F, well, that's going to be very difficult because you've got this diminished over into your tonic. You can do it, but it takes a little bit of massaging, if you will, to make that sound interesting. And if we look down at the bottom in the Mixolydian, if we want to go from the 7th back to our tonic, well, a major to a major, right? B flat major to C major. That's going to sound pretty stable. That's not going to be a big leap, right? For the listener, that's going to sound pretty normal. And that's what gives that Mixolydian that big broad sound, because there's not a big huge like get me back to the tonic quickly. If you tried the 7th to the back to the tonic in Ionian, it just doesn't really work out. But the 7th to the tonic in Mixolydian sounds pretty good, sounds pretty stable. So we want to make certain that we recognize that we need to come back to the tonic. And the trick here, or potential pitfall, is if you're writing a piece of music in, let's say, C Mixolydian, and you're not really paying attention to which chords you're hanging out on. You might hang out on that B flat major a little bit too long and then hit an F. And if you stay on that combination a little bit too long, it's going to sound an awful lot like F major, right? You haven't really pulled away from it. Or even if you stick around on the A minor, right? Because that's the 3rd, and the 3rd is a very powerful interval. So if you go from A minor to F, one too many times, it's really going to sound like F major. It's going to sound like F Ionian. But if you're trying to maintain that C Mixolydian sound and you're not paying attention, these two are going to combine very easily, and it's, to your listener, it's not going to sound very clean. Now, the thing about it is you never change keys, right? You've got one flat. You've never changed keys at all. You're just using this flavoring of the mode. So you don't really hear a key change. It's not very, it's not this huge, intuitive understanding like, oh, wow, he's changing keys. This is just a mix of modes. And so your music is going to kind of blend, and it's just going to kind of sound blasé. You might get people that go, oh yeah, that's a good song. Okay. You might get lucky with one, kind of like a one-hit wonder. But if you're wondering why a lot of bands out there, their songs start to sound the same when they're trying to use modes, it's kind of because of this bleed over. They're not really paying attention to what they need to come back to, what they need to emphasize, where to or where not to hang out for too long if you have a chord progression. So anyways, it's something to be very careful of when you're dealing with modes, because modes are just a flavoring. In this case, C Mixolydian is a flavoring to F Ionian or F major. So if you want to keep that going, then you need to be careful there. The one last thing I want to point out about modes is you can have a song, let's say in F major, and only parts you might want to have that Mixolydian sound, maybe just your bridge or just your verse or just your chorus, whatever it may be. That's fine, because you're not changing keys. So the listener's it's gonna have that stability to it, so no problem there. And going into a Mixolydian for your chorus might sound really cool, or your bridge or whatever. And then you can come back to your F major, and it's gonna sound really good because you've constructed it properly. You haven't just randomly intermingled F major and C Mixolydian without any targeted goal. So just keep that in mind. I just wanted to bring that up. But with all that being said, that really does conclude our conversation on the Mixolydian mode, right? And so a couple things, right? We want to make certain that we avoid sounding like we're in a different mode, especially another major mode, right? We looked at C Mixolydian and F major in this one, but we always want to be careful of that, right? We want to understand the scale as it is the fifth degree from the major, and we want to see that difference so we know what to avoid or linger on too long and making it sound like we've moved into another major mode. Now, this is all typically done with a chord progression, and depending on how you solo over chords, you can kind of get into this as well. But we'll talk more about chord progressions, but that really is kind of the major way that you really start to enjoy the sound of each one of these modes. So with all that being said, the one thing that I want to strongly suggest is if you check out the website, there's a free PDF download in the resources, and it's just a worksheet that you can start working through scales on your own. It will make you much more proficient if you don't understand this stuff very well. I think you need to work through it a couple times, and you'll get it in no time at all. So there is a free PDF that I highly encourage anybody to go download. It'll help you out working through some of this stuff. So with that being said, it really helps out the channel. Would love to get a subscribe from you. Make certain that you're getting notified every time something new is coming out. Really enjoy bringing these videos to you. So, let me know what you think down in the comments below as well. And, we'll keep these coming out. But with all that, thank you so much for watching. Really enjoy putting this one together for everyone. And we will see you in the next series where we start talking about chords. We'll start talking about triads, and we'll move into chord progressions from there, and we'll get into a whole bunch of other stuff. So with all that being said, thanks a lot, everybody.